Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Fillmore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 347, The Poetic Hound. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, it is always poetry to be with you.
Well, that's a very professional or prose sort of kind of observation.
Prosaic. It's prosaic.
No, I wouldn't say prosaic. No. But professional. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
This is a bit of a different show. You know, we've done some scholarship. We've looked at a lot of the minutia, but here I thought we might turn to the type of Sherlockian work that celebrates a particular story and does it in a variety of ways. In this case, we have a couple of different versions of the Hound of the Baskervilles, as it would have been told in poetry. And the reason we're choosing to do this now is because in August of 1901, 122 years ago this month, The Hound of the Baskervilles made its first appearance in print in the Strand magazine. The first chapter was released, and subsequent chapters would be released every month all the way through April of 1902, at the conclusion of which the Hound would be published in book form. So we thought this might be an opportune time to revisit the Hound in poetic form.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you would like to get the show notes to this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles347, all lowercase. Our Patreon supporters have the ability to listen to the show ad-free and are automatically entered as Patreon supporters in a monthly drawing for back issues of the Baker Street Journal and quarterly drawings for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Just go to those show notes or directly to patreon.com/trifles to sign up to become a patron. It can be for as little as $1 a month, or there are levels higher at which you are given a thank you gift. And we do thank you for being part of our journey here and for sending in ideas to us and being great community supporters. We couldn't do this show without your help and without your enthusiasm. We hope that continues far into the future. Well, we mentioned the Hound of the Baskervilles being we're celebrating the anniversary here. And I want to pause here for a moment, Burt, because can you imagine being a Victorian individual and living through nearly 10 years without any new Sherlock Holmes stories?
Well, I never thought about that, but there are always the stories that existed up until then that you could be rereading. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Now that you made that observation, because I remember when I got to the end of reading through all of the Watson's recorded official cases, that I turned to things like August Derleth and Solar Ponds because I didn't want that experience to end. But if we had just, ended at that point and there was nothing else, how about that?
Yeah, and I remember as I read through the stories in their chronologically published form, so A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of Four, and then all of the adventures and memoirs. You get to the end of the memoirs, and there's the final problem, written in 1893, and we end with Watson basically sobbing onto the paper that Sherlock Holmes is no more. And I remember feeling this, even knowing there were further stories, just feeling this great angst and desire for more and great sadness that Sherlock Holmes was gone. And it's hard to think about that as it would have happened over those 8 years in real time. As opposed to our listeners who probably wish our series would end and not come back. So,
well, but your mention, though, reminds me that in the current issue, is this the current issue? The summer 2023 issue of the Baker Street Journal, ably edited by Dan Andriaco. There's an essay here by William Allen Vaselik, Not All Mourned for Holmes. And he says, among other things, I'm not going to, read this. I was just looking at this the other day. He says, the day after Christmas that same year, The Guardian noted with shock that Holmes had successfully unraveled the final problem at the cost of his own life. And according to The Guardian, they wrote, the death of Mr. Sherlock Holmes must have been to a great many people a matter for almost personal regret. Now, of course, because the title of this is Not All Mourn for Holmes, he goes on and talks about other reactions. But it's interesting, isn't it, that even today, after all of this time, occasionally we still turn our thoughts to that moment when it seemed he was gone forever.
Yeah, I mean, it had to be an extraordinarily surprising moment for the reading public. This was a very popular character. It had reinvigorated the Strand magazine, really given it the prominence that it had during that time. And my goodness, I would imagine that if I were the publishers of the magazine, I'd be scrambling myself after reading and probably picking myself up off the floor and trying to determine what it is that we will do to keep our readers engaged, which makes sense as to why they've made such overtures to Conan Doyle to help bring Holmes back.
This is something that we should. This is a good opportunity to mention to our listeners that our other podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, just concluded a really lovely interview with Olivia Ritigliano, who writes for Crime Reads. And she is, among other things, an expert in Victorian fiction. But the reason why this suddenly occurred to me, in addition to giving you a commercial for that, is I wonder, has anyone ever made a list of the authors that benefited from the fact that Holmes was off stage? I mean, that would have been a good question for Olivia. It's also a good question for our listeners. I mean, we're interested. Send us a note, who really benefited? I mean, Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, E.W. Horning, wrote a series of stories and which were collected in book form about the gentleman thief Raffles. But Raffles was and of course Raffles followed the stories of the return, I think, in Collier's magazine in the States, but not really a substitute. So I wonder who really benefited from the absence of Sherlock Holmes on the scene.
That's a great question. And if anybody would like to engage with us on that, please send us an email to trifles@ihearofsherlock.com and give us your thoughts. And perhaps we'll share them here on the air. Well, as we promised, we have a couple of poetic versions of the Hound of the Baskervilles. These were inserts in the dinner packets that appear at everyone's seat at the Baker Street Irregulars annual dinner. We have two, and they are both courtesy of Trevor Raymond, master bootmaker, and then the editor of the Canadian Holmes, which is a prominent Sherlockian publication from the bootmakers of Toronto. So, Bert, why don't you take it away with the first version of the Hound that we're going to hear?
What a great question this is, that folks responded to. If Edgar Allan Poe had written The Hound of the Baskervilles, and this is subtitled A Short Excerpt from the End of Chapter 6 and the Beginning of Chapter 7. Distinctly I remember. It was in a bleak September in Devon, when soft mist oft lay o'er moor and mire and tour. I had come to help unravel tales of paw prints in the gravel. From London Holmes dispatched me as his eyes to go before. Huge footprints of gigantic hound, fantastic local lore. Only twaddle, nothing more. Then upon that midnight dreary, while I pondered, puzzled, weary, tossing, restless, seeking slumber, Morpheus teased from distant shore, as I nodded, nearly sleeping suddenly, I felt a creeping, heard a person's muffled weeping, heard it once, then heard it o'er. 'Tis a woman there, I muttered, out beyond my chamber door, or the wind, and nothing more. On the morrow, in the sunshine, over breakfast with Sir Henry, we'd agreed we'd heard a sobbing, a few moments, nothing more. 2 women there were only, in this manor old and lonely. But which of them was weeping on the night that went before? After breakfast, revelation as I walked the corridor, 'twas the woman Barrymore. Wakeful yet another night, when sleep lingered out of sight, I was roused by stealthy footsteps passing by my chamber door. First I lay engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing. Then I rose and followed slowly, creeping down the corridor. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Merely that, and nothing more. The silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, but a man with a bright candle I could spy through open door. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, as the firelight o'er him streaming threw his shadow on the floor, and the tallow went a-beaming cross the moor and to the tor. Only there, and nowhere more. A taper 'gainst the lattice, lit for lingering moments, stayed there, a signal light into the night, like a beacon blaze of yore. Who unleashed this cryptic fire on Devon moor and Grimpen mire? From whom this stealthy stratagem, this flickering semaphore? The explanation, a conundrum that just made the mystery more. 'Twas the butler, Barrymore.
That was so well done. What a great ear for rhythm and rhyme.
Yeah. Well, Trevor S. Raymond. Here, master bootmaker. That is just lovely. We have to tell Ed Pettit about that. Ed Pettit, our friend from the Rosenbach, who
yes,
is, among other things, an expert in Edgar Allan Poe and many other things.
Wonderful. Well, let's let our sponsor tell everyone about this. In 2023, the BSI Press has added more titles to its roster that you won't want to miss. First up this year is the latest in the BSI manuscript series, a title that takes you, maybe a moment to connect to the story, The Haven Horror. If you guessed the adventure of the retired colorman, you're more clever than Josiah Amberley. This manuscript, once owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle and bequeathed to the British Museum, is a very clean one, coming as it did at the conclusion of the canon. but the essays that accompany it are wonderfully informative. Dan Andriaco looks at prostheses in the canon. The BSI's resident toxicologist Marina Stayich brings us into the realm of poisons. And our own Bert Wolder tells about the life of the artist Frank Wiles. These and more are colorful, just as colorful as the original story that acted as a metaphor and reality, and it treats the reader to a kaleidoscope of shades and hues that will provide hours of reading pleasure. Be sure to get your copy of The Haven Horror before it's sold out at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we're back halfway through our poetic reimagining of The Hound of the Baskervilles. We heard Chapter 6 in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. And now Trevor turns us to Canadian roots, where we hear Chapter 2, a short excerpt from Chapter 2, as if written by Robert W. Service. If you're not familiar with Service, he is a British-Canadian poet who was known as the Bard of the Yukon. He wrote lots of poetry and tales inspired by the Klondike Gold Rush in the late 19th century up there in the Pacific Northwest. So, let's get on with Robert W. Service writing The Hound of the Baskervilles. Strange tales endure on the Devon moor. The stories are still told of unearthly roars round the barren tors that make your blood run cold. The locals tell of a beast from hell that begets this ghastly sound. The dog in the bog of the Grimpen mire, they call it the Baskerville Hound. A bunch of the boys were whooping it up one night in Baskerville Hall. Idle companions and drunken squires, and Sir Hugo, the vilest of all. There's men that somehow grip your eyes and hold them hard like a spell. And such was he, and he looked to be like a man who had come from hell. Wanton and cruel and godless and wild, his name in the West cast fright. But even worse was the ancient curse that he unleashed that night. For it came to pass that Michaelmas, when the moon had risen high, he had seized a yeoman's daughter from a farm that lay nearby. He carried her off to Baskerville Hall and locked her out of sight. But driven by fear, she slipped from here to escape into the night. When Sir Hugo knew, his rage it flew, it whipped him like a lash. He strode through the feast, kicking flagons aside, they scattered with a crash. In that manor hall he shouted to all, as he leapt unto a bench, that he'd sell his soul to the Prince of Hell to overtake that wench. Some were aghast, but Hugo raged on. He became as one possessed. He screamed to his groom to unleash his hounds, and he called for the mare he loved best. Into the night he galloped away, soon followed by some of his friends, who found quite soon in the gleam of the moon where their host and the girl met their ends. The maiden had died of fatigue and fright when she was lifeless found. Sir Hugo's body lay nearby, being torn by a savage hound. It was shaped like a hound, but larger than real, the touchstone of nightmares and fears. Haunting the moors, a plague it has been on the Baskervilles down through the years. Now in the night when the mist lies thick and the tors are lost in the fog, the moors are hunting grounds, they say, for this giant devil dog. No Baskerville can walk there, and few others come to call, for a hideous death from a hellish hound lurks near Baskerville Hall. Strange tales endure on the Devon moor. The stories are still told of unearthly roars round the barren tors that make your blood run cold. The locals tell of a beast from hell that begets this ghastly sound, a dog in the bog of Grimpen mire, and they call it the Baskerville Hound. Well, that's no curse.
This is a great spot if you've not inserted it in editing for the howl of the dog in the night.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, what strikes me is the story that Conan Doyle has presented us with just lends itself to poetry, doesn't it?
Well, as he told his mother, it's a real creeper. And this was a time when gothic fiction, we've got all the great names, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was long before that, but we've got all the great names, Bram Stoker, Count Dracula, Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Yeah, this is...
It's a great time in Gothic literary history.
Yeah.
Well, wanted to just close out with some other little snippets of poetry here, and this is an homage, as it were, to Bill Hyder. I should mention that those two pieces from Trevor Raymond, one came from the BSI dinner in 2003. That was the Edgar Allan Poe version. And then the Robert Service version came from the BSI dinner from 2005. This is one that predates that, and it's by Bill Hyder. Now, Bill traditionally puts an insert, like a half a sheet insert into the BSI dinner packet that everyone receives, and it is what he calls just a trifle. And his little observations about these trifles in the canon were part of what inspired our show here. So Bill's pamphlet from January of 1998, it marked his 10th anniversary of attending the BSI dinner. He put together a pamphlet called Bad Puns Made Verse. And if you listen to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, our interview show, we do a little quiz program there called Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry and we ask you to identify the Sherlock Holmes story. Invariably, Bert has trouble with this assignment and is frequently, nay, consistently wrong, if I'm not mistaken.
No. How sad it is, too.
I know. But you might think that Bert got his inspiration from Bill's pamphlet here, because Bill has little quartets rather than couplets, but they are much along the same lines, using puns as the punchline. So let me give you a couple, Bert, and see what you think. Hard times, sighed Sherlock, far from town, for farmers on this range. Their meeting hall is all run down. See there? The shabby grange.
That's great. I like that.
Mrs. Hudson tea did make, for Holmes was in a hungry mood. And shall I bring the angel cake? No, said Holmes, the devil's food. A donut maker got the sack. The new one was duller. The new one was a duller man. Holmes counseled, get the old one back. Result, the rehired cruller man. Wow.
Ooh.
I know,
yeah,
right?
It's not as, yeah.
Now, Sherlock, said Mycroft, do pick up your fork before this good meal's any colder. Would you care for this leg of highly spiced pork? Or maybe you'd like the bland shoulder.
That's very clever. I mean, the best ones of these, are like a good joke, and in that they've got a little surprise at the end that you're not expecting. But as soon as you hear it, it clicks in, okay, oh, of course. And then, you get the added dimension of connecting it to a Sherlock Holmes case. It's really lovely. Really lovely.
Moans, groans. Groans and bleedings, really. A man 10 feet tall paid Sherlock a call. The master examined his client. You have worked very hard, I perceive, in your yard. You must be the industrious giant. Oh, goodness. Here's a case you can add to your docket, said Holmes, giving Gregson a tip. His matches caught fire in his pocket. The man with the blistered hip. Oh, goodness gracious. Said Watson, only shades of blue would suit my uncle Archibald. No clothes of gray or brown would do. The blue garb uncle, he was called.
Oh.
That's pretty bad. When I get you to groan. Okay, we'll do one last bow here. I don't really care whether A. Conan Doyle was the agent, the author, or what, but I've had endless pleasure because of his toil. So to me, he's the glorious Scot. There you go. Bad puns made verse. Much verse.
Well, there's what started me years ago thinking about the cases of Sherlock Holmes in an alternate way wasn't Bill Hyder's couples, although they're fabulous, but it was Bob Fish, Robert L. Fish.
Yes.
His imagining of Sherlock Holmes, who operated with Dr. Watney at 221 Bagel Street, and those stories, many of which appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. I just thought those were hysterically funny.
They are. Still, and they hold up well.
Yeah.
If you can find some of those, we'll have a link to the Sherlock Holmes and the Bagel Street saga in the show notes. So, little different this time around, but again, it all comes back to Sherlock Holmes, and it's all just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
One companion died that very night of what he saw, and the other twain were broken men for the rest of their days.